There were white spots on old maps of the Soviet Union, areas where no settlements were marked, but thousands of people lived on these empty lands, without an address, without a passport, without the right to leave. They worked on projects that were not mentioned in the newspapers. They built atomic bombs, created chemical weapons, and launched satellites that did not exist. Who were they? Why were their lives erased from history? And what remains behind the fences of these cities today? You will learn what should have been forgotten. The map of the Soviet Union hid much more than it seemed at first glance. While ordinary cities were proudly marked with flags, noted in guidebooks and mentioned in the news, others seemed to disappear into thin air. They were not on geographical maps, they could not be found in atlases, and they were not even mentioned in school textbooks. These places were called closed administrative territorial formations, or ZATO for short. They existed, but at the same time, they did not officially exist. When Soviet citizens opened a map of their country, they saw vast forests, endless fields, and empty zones, which were in fact bustling with life. Tens of thousands of people lived there. Factories operated, reactors were launched, and experiments were conducted. But on paper, there was silence. This silence was not accidental. It was part of a state system of secrecy built around strategically important facilities: nuclear plants, military factories, and scientific centers. These places were too important for anyone outside to know about them, not even their own citizens. The residents of such cities lived in a parallel reality. Their passports did not contain a normal address. Instead, they had a post office box number or the abbreviation of a non-existent place. For example, Chelyabinsk 20, Tomsk 7, Arzamas 16. Formally, they were attached to other administrative units, but in reality, they lived in a closed world behind a high fence with barbed wire. These designations meant nothing to the average person. Even if they suddenly received a letter from a friend with such an address, they would not be able to find the city on a map. ZATOs were not just secret locations. They were entire cities with streets, schools, theaters, and hospitals. The only difference was that all these elements existed in isolation. You could only get there with a special pass, which was issued after the strictest checks. Often, these passes were only given to special service employees, military personnel, and scientists. Leaving was even more difficult. ZATOs were surrounded not only by a physical perimeter, but also by an information vacuum. Anyone who found themselves inside quickly realized that there was no way back. Even a short trip outside the territory required lengthy approvals, permits, and loyalty checks. Many lived for years without being able to leave their city. Even a business trip to another territory became an event of national importance. The usual means of communication, letters, phone calls, were monitored. All information flow was filtered. The most paradoxical thing was that outside these cities, no one knew of their existence. If there was an accident, fire, or radiation leak in a closed city, there was no news about it. If someone died or fell ill, their name disappeared along with them. Even if a relative tried to find a loved one who had been sent on a special assignment, they might receive a curt reply, "No information available." Sometimes there was no reply at all. In such conditions, it was impossible to create a local press or maintain a normal dialogue with the outside world. Newspapers circulating within closed cities were subject to prior censorship. Radio was restricted to a list of stations. Television signals were limited. The world beyond the borders of the ZATO was distant and inaccessible, like another planet. But despite this, life went on inside. People got married, had children, went to school, and to work. Only all this life remained hidden from the outside world. It was as if the USSR had created its own network of secret cities, alive but invisible. After the end of World War II, the Soviet Union found itself facing a new reality. The United States had nuclear weapons, and this completely changed the balance of power in the world. Stalin understood that without a symmetrical response, the USSR was doomed to strategic backwardness. It was then that a project was conceived that would later be called the Soviet Atomic Shield. And with it came the need to create an invisible infrastructure, isolated from the outside world. Thus was born the idea of closed cities. As early as 1943, Soviet intelligence, acting through a network of agents, obtained information about the Manhattan Project in the United States. Stalin entrusted Lavrenti Beria with overseeing the atomic program, and urgent work began on the creation of the first uranium and plutonium production facilities. But such facilities could not be located in ordinary settlements. It was too dangerous and too secret. Isolated areas were needed. Thus began the construction of the first closed cities in the Chelyabinsk, Tomsk, and Nizhny Novgorod regions. Officially, these cities were not called by their real names. Arzamas 16 instead of Sarov, Chelyabinsk 25 instead of Ozersk, Tomsk 7 instead of Seversk. These were not just cities. They were strategic complexes built from scratch in remote forests, far from major roads and communication lines. They were surrounded by fences several kilometers long, guarded by armed units. Inside were laboratories, reactors, assembly shops, and secret institutes. Outside, there was nothing. Not a single sign, not a single name. The work was carried out in extreme conditions. The people sent to build the complexes lived in barracks and worked 12 to 15 hours a day. Many were prisoners of the Gulag, sentenced to corrective labor. Alongside them were military engineers, young specialists, and party officials. It was an ideological project to create a weapon of retaliation at any cost. By 1949, the USSR had successfully tested its first atomic bomb. The tests were conducted in strict secrecy, but rumor had it that the explosion occurred not far from Semipalatinsk. All materials used in the creation of the bomb were produced in closed cities. These cities became hubs of a new world, a world in which victory was measured in kilotons. Since the early 1950s, the number of closed cities has been growing rapidly. Facilities were created to develop missiles, satellites, anti-radar systems, and neutron weapons. Secrecy became the norm. Every employee signed a non-disclosure agreement. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. A scientist could know a formula, but not where it would be used. A worker could assemble a device without knowing that it was a warhead. The system was built on fragmentation and control. In addition to military tasks, the ZATO served the strategic needs of the state. Communication, biological protection, psychophysiological influence, and climate modeling systems were developed here. Some of the projects are still classified. It is known that in the 1960s, there was a program to create underground cities that could function autonomously in the event of a nuclear war. Their centers were built in ZATOs. The history of the Soviet space program also began in these territories. The first artificial Earth satellite, launched in 1957, was assembled with the participation of specialists from closed cities. The same was true of the spacecraft in which Yuri Gagarin went into space. But nowhere was this written about. Reports went directly to the Politburo. The cities remained silent. Each of these places was a small state, with its own logic. Streets with Soviet names, clubs, schools, swimming pools, and everywhere security guards, checkpoints, searches, and communications interception. These cities were created not only as centers of science, but also as ideological crystals, where people became part of a great task. The very task that was forbidden to talk about, even with one's own children. Formally, residents received good conditions, housing, food, bonuses. But informally, they paid with restrictions on their freedom, complete isolation, and the constant threat of punishment for divulging information. In this atmosphere, a new generation of Soviet citizens was born. Loyal, silent, convinced that they were doing a great thing. It was these people who were entrusted with the nuclear briefcase. Closed cities became the skeleton of a great power. Without them, there would have been no nuclear shield, no Gagarin, no strategic parity. But the price was paid not only in money and metal, it was paid by people. With their lives, their silence, their fear. If you were born in a closed city, you had no right to just pick up and leave. You were part of a system that began with your first breath and ended, not always, with your death. In the ZATO, there was no familiar freedom of movement, no familiar life, no familiar understanding of where I live. Addresses here sounded like codes, and passports were not issued for years. A person could live for decades without official recognition that they even existed. Inside the closed cities lived not just employees, but residents without a homeland. They had homes, families, streets, jobs, but all of this was within a strictly defined perimeter. Nothing before, nothing after. Even relatives could not visit you unless they had the appropriate permission. Schools, clinics, theaters, everything was internal, localized, under control. Even trips to neighboring areas were organized under the supervision of the special services, and only for trusted party workers or outstanding school children. Children were a special category. They were born in a city that did not exist. Attempts to register a child in another region were fraught with problems. There was no address. As a result, children from closed cities often could not enroll in universities outside the zone. They needed special permission. Even joining the army could be tricky. The local military registration office didn't know where to send the draft notice. Teens from closed cities said they couldn't write to classmates who had left the zone. Letters were censored and sometimes didn't even leave the city. Even documents were unusual. Passports were often only issued when people found work, which was at a mature age. Sometimes they were not issued at all. There were cases where people lived their entire lives with a temporary identity card issued in a closed city and were unable to get married or leave. Appeals to state authorities in other cities were either ignored or returned with the wording, "Address not confirmed." Housing conditions stood apart. At first glance, it was almost paradise. New houses, hot water, heating, furniture, things that were not available in rural areas or even in the capitals. There were almost no queues for food, and many closed cities had special shops. This was a bonus for silence and isolation. However, the illusion of prosperity crumbled as soon as one remembered that no literature was brought into the city. Private photography was prohibited, and libraries were overflowing with censored publications. Ideology controlled everything. Medical care was available, but not always effective. This was especially true when it came to the effects of working with radiation or toxic substances. People fell ill, but could not leave the zone for diagnosis. Illnesses were disguised as colds, and cancer was not mentioned aloud. There were cases where entire houses suffered from radiation exposure, but no investigations were conducted. Everything was hushed up. In cities where plutonium was produced or uranium was processed, the incidence of disease was higher than the national average. But statistics were strictly classified. Social life also had its peculiarities. Marriages were arranged within the city. Rarely did anyone enter into a relationship with someone from outside, simply because there was no one to meet. Children followed in their parents' footsteps. They attended the same schools and enrolled in the same institutions. Leaving meant breaking with the entire system, and breaking was almost impossible. Even when someone was dismissed from their job, they did not always have the right to leave the territory. They could be frozen, denied access but left inside, dependent on others. It was a kind of administrative arrest. Some cities had so-called buffer zones, settlements surrounding the closed city, where service personnel, security guards, and technical staff lived. These settlements were half open, but it was still only possible to get into the main city with a pass. This created an additional hierarchy. People were divided into those who were inside and those who were at the fence. The system was designed to make people feel special, but also dependent. You kind of live better than those outside the perimeter, but you pay for it with your freedom, silence, and conformity. You don't rebel. You don't argue. You're part of the machine. And if you suddenly decide to leave, you disappear. Sometimes, literally. The city without a name is not just a metaphor. It is a reality in which thousands of people existed. They were a special kind of citizen, not enemies of the regime, not dissidents, but not free citizens either. They were people with limited status, citizens of an invisible empire. What happened inside these closed cities? What processes, experiments, and industries were so secret that they required complete isolation from the world? The answer is both simple and disturbing. These cities were home to everything that could change the balance of power on the planet. Nuclear weapons, missiles, chemical reagents, biological strains, satellite systems, and devices for intercepting and suppressing signals. This was the pinnacle of the USSR's scientific and technical thought, and at the same time, its dark side. Let's start with the main thing: the nuclear shield. In Ozersk, at the Mayak plant, plutonium was being produced. In Artemis 16, design work was underway to create warheads. In Tomsk 7, there was one of the world's largest chemical and metallurgical plants. It was there, in 1993, that a radiation leak occurred, which would later be called the Second Chernobyl. Officially, it was a minor leak. In reality, it was contamination of the soil and air. which was only discovered thanks to satellite data from Western intelligence. Working in such cities was fraught with constant danger. Radiation levels often exceeded the norm. Employees had access to hazardous materials without knowing it. Many experiments were conducted without adequate protection. Illnesses, mutations, infertility. All of this was recorded, but not disclosed. Doctors were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, and pathologists were sworn to silence. Sometimes the results of autopsies were simply destroyed. In addition to the nuclear sector, chemical laboratories played a special role. In some closed cities, substances were created that could cause paralysis, memory loss, and aggression. The aim was to control the behavior of the enemy or to establish control over the masses. Projects of this kind were later developed as part of the Farvater and Picnic programs, which are known only from fragmentary declassified reports. Some experts speak of attempts to develop chemicals that affect the emotional state, allegedly used to suppress protest activity. Work on biological weapons was no less secretive. One of the closed cities in the Urals was home to a research institute that modified strains of anthrax, tularemia, and cholera. The goal was to create controlled epidemics capable of spreading in a limited area with a predictable duration. This research was classified as particularly dangerous. In the event of a leak, the death toll could have been massive. According to unofficial data, such cases did occur. But the victims were buried anonymously, with the cause of death listed as industrial accident. Psychological experiments are also interesting. In some closed cities, equipment for remote influence on the human psyche was tested. Infrasonic devices, electromagnetic fields, and neurostimulators were used. Some of this research later moved into military medicine, and some into psychotronic projects that were never officially recognized. Former employees spoke of observing the reactions of test subjects who were placed in specially shielded chambers and exposed to waves of various frequencies. Their behavior changed. Aggression, apathy, insomnia. Everything was recorded. The reports are classified. The space program was also actively developing. Spy satellites designed to intercept NATO radio communications were being built in Zheleznogorsk. Global navigation systems were being installed in other closed cities, and prototypes of the Soviet GPS were being created. Some facilities worked with ultra-long-range antennas, some of which were several kilometers long. It was said that they could even see underground. Perhaps this is where rumors of telepathic experiments and contact with unknown life forms originated. Accidents were a separate issue. Explosions, leaks, and fires occurred in closed cities, but no one outside their perimeter knew about them. Once, a reactor caught fire in Ozersk. In Arzamas, there was an explosion during the assembly of a warhead. In Tomsk, there was a toxic gas leak. Information was either concealed or distorted. The dead were buried as accident victims. Sometimes entire shifts disappeared from the list. Relatives were forbidden from holding public funerals. It was behind these fences that technologies were developed that could have changed the course of history, if they had gotten out of control. Weapons of mass destruction, hybrid methods of influence, and technology for waging war in new forms were created there. It was an intellectual front, and at the same time, a chemical and biological trap into which its own citizens fell. A huge amount of information about the ZATO is still inaccessible. The archives are closed. The participants are silent. Some are afraid. Some are already dead. All we know are fragments, articles, memories, leaks. Everything else is behind the fence, classified as top secret. People living in a closed city were in a unique psychological trap. On the one hand, there was a sense of importance. You were part of something great, a secret mission, science, defense, space. On the other hand, there was the awareness of complete isolation, subordination, and the impossibility of escape. It was a prison with amenities, a spacious cage with bonuses for silence, and everything that happened inside shaped a special type of personality. Disciplined, closed, prone to self-control, and blind trust in the system. The world of ZATO began in childhood. Even in kindergarten, children were taught not to say too much. From an early age, they were taught, "We are special. Our city is special. You must not tell anyone about it." A child who went to visit his grandmother in a neighboring village could not say where he lived. A teenager could not participate in national academic competitions without special permission. All this caused growing anxiety and a habit of keeping quiet. Psychologists working in the ZATO noted high levels of anxiety, a tendency towards autism, and internal escape among children. Among adults, there was increased suspiciousness, dependence on rituals, and fear of the unknown. People got used to living under control. They didn't need to be locked up in prison. They were already there, without bars or locks. The working day often began with a search. Pockets, bags, notebooks, everything was checked. Even notes about the air temperature could be confiscated. Excessive observation. Telephone conversations were tapped. Mail was filtered. In some cities, an unspoken rule was introduced. Do not keep diaries. Those who tried to write memoirs or collect family photo archives risked attracting the attention of the authorities. In closed cities, those who remembered too much were not liked. Neighbors kept an eye on each other, not necessarily out of fear, but rather out of habit. Rumors spread quickly. If someone traveled outside the zone too often, talked about foreign films, or subscribed to the wrong magazine, they could be called in for a chat. Or the department head might suddenly mention their name at a planning meeting. A colleague has been careless. Everyone would know who they were talking about. Women in closed cities often had a double burden. On the one hand, they had their usual roles as mothers, workers, and participants in social competitions. On the other hand, they had a duty to be reliable, trustworthy, and silent. There were cases when families were destroyed because of suspicions of insufficient loyalty. The husband was an engineer with access. The wife was a teacher who talked too much on the train. The consequences were dismissal, transfer, demotion, sometimes deportation to a buffer zone. Life was both comfortable and harsh. There were no queues in shops, but there wasn't much choice either. Food parcels were standard, and in Berezka shops, you could only buy with vouchers. Books were available from lists recommended by the party committee. There was only one TV channel. The radio was local. Exceptions were rare and always under surveillance. Holidays in the closed city were mandatory and almost military in nature. Marches, parades, rallies, posters, everything was strictly according to plan. Participation was not negotiable. Even school matinees were sometimes filmed for internal reporting. People smiled, clapped their hands, danced in circles, and knew that every gesture could be reviewed by the personnel department. Joy according to plan. Rumors were an integral part of life. Someone heard about a neighbor who was taken away and never returned. Someone else heard about a leak at the facility. Some heard about an American satellite that had allegedly photographed the city. There was no confirmation, but everyone knew that if you kept quiet, you lived longer. Sometimes it was better not to know. Sometimes it was better to know but pretend you didn't understand. People adapted. They got used to it. They lived. And some even loved it. Some sincerely. Some out of calculation. But everyone understood that this city was not just a home. It was part of the body of the state. If you cut it off, it would start to bleed. And if you protested, the body would reject you. Literally. Life in a cage. Comfortable. Cozy. Guarded. But still a cage. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the fate of the closed cities was in question. What to do with places that officially did not exist? With thousands of people not registered in the registry? What about the factories that produced nuclear materials but had become obsolete? There were no answers. Perestroika swept away all plans. Funding stopped. Some closed cities were abandoned. Others were converted. But most remained. And they still exist today, in a paradoxical status, seemingly open, but still closed. The first years after 1991 were a shock for the residents of closed cities. People who had lived behind a fence for decades were suddenly confronted with the outside world. Shops without prices, streets without security, freedom, and chaos. Many felt confused. Others felt fear. The familiar system had collapsed. Pensions were delayed, food disappeared, and salaries were frozen. The city, which had seemed like a fortress, turned out to be a forgotten enclave that no one needed. Some facilities began to be dismantled. Equipment was removed, reactors were shut down, and laboratories were closed. This was accompanied by mass layoffs. Scientists became unemployed. Workers became destitute. Some tried to emigrate. Others sought any job outside the closed city. But many did not have a residence permit, a normal passport, or proof of education. The state that had created their reality had no plan B. But not all cities disappeared. Some closed cities were transformed into so-called territories with special status. For example, Zheleznogorsk, Seversk, and Zarechny. They received a new legal status, but retained their access restrictions. There is a barrier at the entrance and checks at the exit. The pass system, although relaxed, is still in place. Even in the 2000s, not every Russian could just walk into such a city. Formally, these cities live like normal ones. They have an administration, a mayor, local elections, schools, and clinics. But informally, much remains the same. There is limited access to information and increased attention from the special services. Special conditions for businesses. And, most importantly, the atmosphere. Those who were born in a closed city still feel different. Wary, withdrawn, observant. It's a culture, or a habit, or a scar. Some cities have been able to adapt. For example, Sarov has become a scientific center with international participation. Seversk is an industrial zone controlled by Rosatom. Conferences are held there. Foreigners come to visit. But not everywhere. There are cities where there is still no normal infrastructure, communications, or transport. Where pensioners live, forgotten by the country, but still keeping silent. Because they don't know how to do anything else. Stories about leaks, mutations, and radiation spots periodically surface in the media. About attempts to sell equipment abroad. About black archives. But everything quickly dies down. Because the legacy of the ZATO is not just buildings and documents, it is people, and they do not want to remember, because they know that the price of memory can be too high. Today, Russia officially recognizes about 40 closed administrative entities. Some of them are still unnamed on the map. Others are marked, but do not indicate anything. These are remnants of the past, or its continuation. And perhaps they hold the keys to understanding how a system capable of keeping secrets for decades was built. Secret cities have not disappeared. They have become shadows in a new reality. No one looks for them on the map anymore, but they are still there, with their streets, their names, their memories, and with stories that have never been told.